right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to Kirsten and Kenny for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with you today virtually. So I'm really excited because this is probably my favorite topic to talk about. My favorite shark, my favorite animal. And in San Diego, we're very lucky because we have this amazing phenomenon that you see here right in our backyard. And so what you're looking at here is a leopard shark aggregation. So when we see a lot of sharks or fish, a lot of people will call this a school, but technically a school of fish, they're all swimming together in the same direction. They're actually getting somewhere. In the case of these leopard sharks that we see just outside the surf in waist deep water off La Jolla, which is in San Diego County, they don't really move together. They're just sort of all milling around, but although they may drift, a few hundred feet here and there, they're mostly in the same area. So when I came to San Diego in 2007 to start my PhD, I was looking for a project to do. I didn't know exactly what I was going to be studying, but I learned about these leopard sharks pretty early on. And of course, I got in the water with them. I heard they were harmless. So I got in the water with these 5-foot sharks and started snorkeling with them. And it was amazing. If you've never been snorkeling with these sharks, it's actually a very peaceful, relaxing experience. Sometimes frustrating because it's hard to get close to them because they're actually kind of skittish, which you don't really expect for sharks. And as you can imagine, the first question I had when I started sharing the company of these sharks is, why are they doing this? And why right here? Why not a few hundred feet up the beach? And so I got in the water and I spent a lot of time with them trying to look for clues as to why they were doing this and why that particular spot. And early on, before drones were all the rage, we had a giant helium balloon that was tethered to these weights that we had, and we sent it up with a first generation GoPro. So this would have been a Hero 1 if you're familiar with the brand. It's nothing like, there's nothing like seeing these animals from the sky to really appreciate how many there are and just how close to shore they are. And just to prove that this is a balloon, you can actually see the shadow of this 6-foot balloon right here in the upper right of your screen. So, as I said, got in the water with them looking for clues as to why they're there, but puzzled because it's not immediately clear why they're there. They're not mating. They're not feeding. They're not giving birth. They're not doing anything obvious. They're just swimming around seemingly kind of aimlessly. So this was a really, really interesting question, and it ended up being the topic of my dissertation work. So just to quickly orient you, if you're not too familiar with this area, which is very close to where y'all are in Orange County there. So downtown San Diego is around here, La Jolla is here, and the aggregation spot is right at the southern end of famous La Jolla Shores Beach, just inshore of La Jolla Submarine Canyon, which we're seeing right there. And what you're seeing up here in the upper left, that's what these sharks look like if you were to go kayaking with them. This is what they look topside. You just kind of see these ominous shadows lurking underneath, right? So again, the question is, why? Why are they here? So before we answer that question, a little bit of background about this particular species. So the leopard shark is endemic to the western coast of North America, meaning it's found here and nowhere else in the world. And although their range spans everywhere from Samish Bay, Washington, all the way down to Mazatlan, Mexico, it's really California that's the core of their range. And throughout California, there are previously documented aggregation spots. La Jolla is not the only place they form these aggregations. So other places where they do it include places like Humboldt Bay, Tomales Bay, which is just north of San Francisco Bay. That's another place where they aggregate. Elkhorn Slough, which comprise the backwaters of Monterey Bay. Morro Bay, various bays and coves around Catalina Island. So if you hear the common thread here is that previously studied or previously known aggregation sites were all sheltered bays, coves, and estuaries. And that kind of makes a lot of sense because these sheltered bays, coves, and estuaries are calm, they're warm, there's plenty of food there for leopard sharks. And so this is what makes the La Jolla site so different and so interesting. It is not in a sheltered cove, bay, or estuary. It is in fact along the open coast where there is surf, sometimes very big surf. Right, so again, just this is a zoomed in area, southern end of La Jolla Shores Beach. Scripps Pier is up here, less than a mile north. And again, we are right inshore of La Jolla Submarine Canyon. So before we started actually like studying these sharks and tracking their movements and really trying to understand why they're here, the first thing I really wanted to do was understand the history of this particular site and the history of the sharks at this particular site. And this is something I always stress to my students. It's important to know the history of what you are studying. And so I started digging around in the archives of Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and I found something really interesting. It was the original handwritten collection notes of Scripps professor Carl Hubbs. And so if you take a look at this original handwritten note here, it is dated August 3rd, 1950. And the location is just south of La Jolla Beach and Tennis Club on La Jolla Shore. So La Jolla Beach and Tennis Club is this red roof complex right here. So just south would have been right around here where we know the present day aggregation is. And of course, what he found were 3 large adults, about 5 feet, Triachus semifasciata. That's the scientific name for leopard sharks. So we've known about these leopard sharks at least since 1950 at this site, but very likely they were here long time before that. So what's really interesting about this La Jolla site is that it used to be a sheltered estuary, just like the other aggregation sites along California. And there's a lot of evidence for this throughout the canyon. So there are estuarine deposits between about 16 and 27 meters throughout the head of La Jolla Canyon. There's outcrops in the walls of the canyon of mud, silt, clay, and gypsum. A lot of these materials do not deposit in highly turbulent environments. So they wouldn't really be depositing much nowadays, but they did deposit when this was a sheltered bay. There are fossils of brackish water ostracods, which are these little crustaceans, and fibrous root material dated about 8,000 years before present. So this used to be an estuary, very, very interesting. And remnants of this estuarine lagoon, this brackish water lagoon, persisted in La Jolla Shores through the early 20th century. And so digging in those archives some more, you can find some really interesting pictures. So this one is over 100 years old, and it's a view looking south toward La Jolla Shores is where this black arrow is pointing. We have Mount Soledad up here. This was the original Scripps Institution of Oceanography. That was the first building right there. I guess this is the 5. I'm not sure what that is. But what you see here, all of La Jolla Shores used to be underwater. This was the remnants of that sheltered estuary. And here's another picture now looking from Mount Soledad north toward Scripps. And we see the newly built Scripps Pier just barely visible right there. But again, we see La Jolla Shores is underwater. And although we see this kind of barrier beach right here, what we call today La Jolla Shores, there were times when this, because of wave action, this was sort of, it was still open to the open ocean. Little bit of interesting history. So what is now known as La Jolla Beach and Tennis Club was originally going to be La Jolla Beach and Yacht Club. The plan was to basically dredge out a channel from the remnants of that estuary and turn it into a little marina. So we see them starting to do that here. I have an original artist rendering of what the La Jolla Beach and Yacht Club was going to be. You see we have this lagoon back here, and there was going to be a channel. The problem was you can't just have a channel going out into the open ocean. You also have to have a breakwater to block the waves from coming into the marina and causing havoc on all the boats that are docked there. The problem with trying to form a breakwater just offshore here is that canyon. As they tried to form a breakwater, the boulders that they were dropping just kept rolling down into the canyon. So they never actually made any progress and piled it up above the water surface. So eventually, they tried. We see here from 1930, they were trying to dredge it out. They were going to do it. And then they eventually gave up on that because of the canyon. And La Jolla Beach and Yacht Club became La Jolla Beach and Tennis Club, which is what we see today. And all that is left of that original estuary is the little duck pond. behind La Jolla Beach and Tennis Club. Now, the reason I tell you all this, one, it's cool. Again, it's interesting to know the history of your field site. And it's not to say that somehow the remnants of this, this little duck pond is somehow still attracting the sharks here, but it is to say that a long time ago, thousands of years ago, this site was probably just like the other aggregation sites, and that these sharks were likely aggregating here thousands and thousands of years ago. The estuary is no longer here, but the sharks remain. So the question is, what is still attracting them to this site? Right? So the main question is why, but it's kind of hard to answer that why question directly. So we ask other more specific questions to get at the why question. So first we're going to ask, who are these leopard sharks demographically speaking? What clues do they have? Are they male? Are they female? Are they mature? Are they immature? Right? That's going to give us clues as to why they're here. What exactly are they doing? I mean, I said they're just swimming, right? But when we start tracking their movements, what other clues? What else do we about what they're actually doing at this site? Where are they doing it? What's special about the site that they hang out? And finally, when are they aggregating on both a daily and a seasonal time scale? All of those specific questions will get at the overarching research question, which is why. So first off, who are the leopard sharks? So over the course of many, many years, we captured, tagged, and these hundreds and hundreds of these sharks. And what we found, amazingly, was that 97% of these leopard sharks are female. Only 3% are male. So of course, this amounts to only about 3 in 100 of these sharks being male. And so right off the bat, we can say what they're probably not doing here. They're probably not mating. A lot of people thought that this was a mating aggregation, a spawning aggregation. I've heard all kinds of things like that. They're not mating here if the sex ratio is that skewed toward females. Typically, mating aggregations in sharks and other animals, the sex ratio is closer to 50-50. So they're not doing that. But something else amazing about these females is that they are mature and they are also pregnant. And we know they're pregnant because we conducted ultrasounds on them to confirm this. So now our question becomes, what are these pregnant female leopard sharks doing here? Right? So we're going to answer the what are they doing here question with two kinds of acoustic tracking. So the first method we're going to use is called manual acoustic tracking, also called active acoustic tracking, because we're going to actively follow these sharks and see where they go. So the way this works is we capture the sharks, as you see here, and we tag them with an acoustic pinger tag. So this is about the size of your index finger or like a AA battery. And this pinger tag has temperature and depth sensors on them. And it's constantly pinging at a frequency that no other animal can hear. But what we can, but once the shark is released, we can hear those pings with a directional hydrophone. So that's this little device here. So it's an underwater microphone listening for sound. It's tuned just to the frequency that those tags are pinging at. And it's mounted at the bottom of this rotatable staff. So because it's directional, it's only listening in one direction. So as we rotate the staff above the water, we're rotating this directional hydrophone under the water, and we're listening for whether the sound gets louder or softer. And we can basically kind of zero in on the direction of the loudest sound, know that's the direction of the shark, and then we proceed to follow the shark in our boat. And that directional hydrophone is then connected to this device right here, which is the acoustic receiver. This is the device that is decoding the pings, displaying on the screen the depth and the temperature of the shark, and also recording GPS positions along the way. So we did this to 8 sharks, and we tracked each shark for 48 hours. So we're on the boat 48 hours nonstop. It's always a tracking team of 2 people. Wherever the shark goes, we go. And typically we do like a we take turns. So one person will do 3 hours of tracking while the other person sleeps, and then we can switch. And we just keep going back and forth every 3 hours for 2 days. So the first thing I'm going to show you is what these sharks did vertically in the water column. Remember that these acoustic pinger tags have depth sensors on them. So we have a little schematic here. We're looking at depth below the surface in meters. And what these bars represent is the percent of the shark's time spent in that particular depth bin. So the big take home here is that the sharks spent the vast majority of their time, more than 70% of their time, in the top 2 meters of the water column. And not only were they shallow, but they were very close to shore, often at and sometimes even inside of the surf zone. And we knew that not only from tracking them, we had to be very careful with the boat not to get too close to shore, but because of those aerial balloon surveys that we did early on. Now, we were wondering, why are they so shallow and close to shore? Now, at first we thought maybe this was like a predator avoidance mechanism, right? You can kind of imagine if you're kind of up against the shoreline in very shallow water, you've now kind of you've eliminated one direction from which you can be attacked, that being from shore, right? So you can kind of hug the coastline and look out. And the other thing is, if you're really shallow, then really big animals just physically cannot access that very shallow water. But the problem with that hypothesis was that the main predator of leopard sharks at this site was the male California sea lion. And the male sea lion, it turns out, has no problem taking leopard sharks in very shallow water. In fact, they'll sometimes use that to their advantage by charging against the leopard sharks with such force, actually beaching themselves with the shark in their mouth, and then they kind of wiggle back into the water, pulling the shark with them. After they do that, they grab the shark just under the gills and they thrash them above the water with such force, it actually eviscerates them. All the internal organs come out, which for a shark, if you're familiar, is mostly made up of fatty liver. So the male sea lion proceeds to eat that and then usually leaves the rest of the shark, which washes ashore. People freak out. I get calls from the lifeguard, tell them no, nothing to worry about. This is just the male sea lions being kind of mean. But the take home message here is that being close to shore is probably not helping with predation. In fact, if anything, it's making them more vulnerable. So the backup hypothesis, the alternative that we had, was that, well, maybe it has to do with water temperature. So at this particular site, there is, in terms of where warm water comes from, there's no geothermal vent. There's no river outflow. There's no power plant that's putting out warm water like we see in other parts of the coast of California. So the only source of heat is the sun beating down on the water and warming it from the top down. So where they're hanging out is where the warmest water is, near the surface. But it's not just that, right? We know in California we have a prevailing onshore breeze. And so if the warmest water is near the surface, well, we have the prevailing onshore breeze that's now blowing all that warm surface water shoreward and piling it up in the surf. That's exactly where the sharks are hanging out, shallow and close to shore. So we think that they're attracted to the warm water of this site. And so our ongoing hypothesis is that these pregnant females, they're actually incubating their developing embryos in this warm water. Leopard sharks, like most sharks, not all, but most sharks, are ectothermic, meaning that they derive the body heat from the surrounding water temperature. So whatever the water temperature is, that's what their body temperature is. And what you may know is that as your body temperature increases, metabolism increases. Chemical reactions speed up. So things like metabolism, embryonic development, and those are all going to speed up. Cell division, that's going to speed up. And so what that effectively means is that their gestation period gets shortened just a little bit. The gestation period for pregnant leopard sharks is already pretty long. It's about 10 to 11 months, so even longer than a human. And they do this every year. So if you do the math, we know that these sharks give birth in April and May. Well, for them to give birth the following April and May after a 10 to 11 month gestation period, they only get about 1 to 2 months to kind of recover, mate, and get the whole process started again. So you can imagine that it's very beneficial to them if they can shave off a few weeks by hanging out in warm water. That speeds up the rate of embryonic development. But there's still the question of why this particular site. What's special about this site? So I already mentioned that they're hanging out right in front of the head of La Jolla Submarine Canyon. Turns out that is not a coincidence. There's a reason for that. So based on the tracks, the active acoustic tracks that I told you about before, what we were able to calculate is something called a 95% KUD. This stands for kernel utilization distribution. You don't have to remember that term, but know that it describes the area where these sharks can be found 95% of the time. So we also call this the home range. This is the main area where the sharks are hanging out. And we see that's right in front of the canyon. And then we can also look at the 50% KUD, which is where they're found 50% of the time, which you may think is like, well, that's less than 95, but look at how much smaller that area is. So their movements are much more concentrated in this area. So we call that the core area of the aggregation. And that's right in line with the main axis of the canyon. Now comes the fun part. We can plot, or we can overlay on these 95 and 50% KUDs, a map of wave height during the times we actually tracked these sharks. So these colors are not, this is not temperature, right? This is wave height. So you look at this little, little key over here. The warmer colors indicate larger waves, higher waves, about a meter tall here. And then the cool colors, the blue, indicate calmer conditions, smaller waves. And so what we see here is that the home range, that 95% KUD, is sort of nestled in what's called a divergence zone, this area of low wave height, low wave energy, which is caused by the shape of the canyon, the bathymetry of the canyon. So as the waves come to shore, the waves start to interact with the bathymetry, with the shape of the canyon. And what you see there is the wave energy gets diverted away from the canyon head, producing small waves where the sharks are hanging out, but in other places, creating convergent zones where the wave energy converges, creating large waves where the sharks are not hanging out. And if you've ever gone like just walking along the Jolla Shores Beach here, you can confirm this. Just you can see that the waves are bigger. You can also see where the surfers are hanging out. The surfers are here. They are not down here because the waves are much smaller. Because of this canyon up here, there's a second canyon called Scripps Canyon, which looks a little bit differently than La Jolla Canyon, but you also get another big convergence zone up here. That's famous Black's Beach. Very, very big waves there. Right? So the 95% KUD is located in this calm wave energy zone. And we see that the core, where they spend most of their time, is located in the only dark blue patch. That is the calmest area, right in line with the axis of the canyon. So they're hanging out in calm water. And what this means is that this is also warmer water. Remember, the only source of heat is the sun, and it heats from the top down. If the water is calmer, the water is stratified, meaning that it kind of is stagnant and it's not mixing with the deeper, colder water. In these red areas here where there's big waves, it is mixing. So even though the sun is heating down, that hot water, it keeps mixing and it doesn't really heat up as much as the area where the sharks are hanging out. So this area tends to be about a degree or two warmer than the surrounding areas, which may not sound like a lot, but given the choice, that's where the sharks hang out. And the calm water also allows the sharks to more easily access the warmest water, which because of the prevailing onshore breeze is being piled up in the surf. It's going to be harder for them to access those warmest shallows a few hundred feet up the beach where the waves are much bigger and they're going to get pummeled and knocked around by those big waves. So one last thing about the active tracking, I just want to show you just what one representative shark did over the course of 24 hours so you can kind of get a feel. So you're going to be looking at the left little map over here, and you're going to see what a shark did. So we track the shark starting here. We see its track is yellow, the color of the sun. This is what it did during the day. And then it turns to night. This is what it does at night. So they go, their movements expand, right? They go down into the canyons, and then by sunrise, again, they return to the aggregation site, to that calm area. So now we were wondering, what are they doing at night, actually going into the canyon? It's cold there after all. Why would they do that? Well, something that happens in the canyon every night is spawning of market squid. So these squid, during the day, they're much deeper, outside of range of where the leopard sharks typically go, but at night, they come into the shallows of the canyon and they start spawning. And we thought that they would probably be easy picking for the sharks, and that's probably what they were eating, but we needed to test that, whether they were actually eating that. So we had to do a diet study to see what exactly they were eating and confirm whether they actually had squid in their stomachs. Now, 30, 40, 50 years ago, the way a diet study would have been conducted is we would have had to kill a bunch of leopard sharks, dissect open their stomachs and see what was there. But people like leopard sharks, right? This is a marine protected area, right? We want to set a good example as scientists and not go kill a bunch of sharks in a marine reserve. So we had to come up with a way to non-lethally determine what they were eating. So we developed a method that we call gastric lavage. And so basically we caught leopard sharks, about 70 of them, brought them onto the boat, put them on their backs, which induces a state called tonic immobility. It's kind of a state of hypnosis where they kind of go to sleep. And then we put a PVC tube down into their stomach, flush their stomach with seawater, kind of squish them around, and then turn them upside down and allow gravity to do the rest. And then we caught whatever came out in a spaghetti strainer. And what we found, sure enough, was that their stomachs were full of these market squid. So that's indeed what they were eating when they were going down into the canyon at night. They do feed on other things. We see a lizard fish right here. We found like crab legs, lobster legs, a giant octopus right there. So they eat plenty of other things, but the main, most important component of their diet is the market squid. And all that's important because this site, it goes to why this site is special, right? I mean, you could have the canyon creating calm, warm water, and that's all great for incubation. But if there's no food nearby, the sharks aren't going to be there for too long, right? So the icing on the cake so far is that there is plenty of food nearby in that submarine canyon. But I mentioned before that there were two ways that we acoustically tracked these sharks. The first one was actively, where we actively followed the shark in a boat. This second way is called passive or automated acoustic tracking. We need this because we want to now track these sharks for more than 3 years. And there's no way I'm going to be on a boat following a shark one by one for 3 years each. So we had to come up with a different way to do that. So we did this for 19 sharks, and we actually surgically implanted the pinger tags into their body cavities. Now, the reason we have to do this is the following. You can't just externally tag a shark like we did previously and expect that tag to stay on for 3 years. There's just no way. It's going to get tangled on seagrass, tangled in kelp, maybe rubbed off on a rock. So the only way to ensure that the sharks stay tagged and trackable for long periods of time is to surgically implant them. And we also, what we did with these tags, as you see here, we coated them in beeswax. We did that to reduce the chances of immunological rejection. That is the body of the shark kind of attacking this foreign plastic thing that we're sticking into the shark. So at least beeswax is a natural product, less likely to induce that kind of immunological reaction. And it seems to have worked, right? We had 100% survival with our sharks. So after we implant the shark, or we suture them up and we release them, and then instead of actively following them, we're now passively listening for them. And we did that with these underwater acoustic receivers. So these are each about 1 foot long. And instead of a directional hydrophone listening in only one direction, these had omnidirectional acoustic receivers listening 360 degrees. And so each one of these receivers was mounted to an underwater mooring, and they had a detection range of about 300 meters radius, so about 1,000 feet. So basically, anytime an implanted shark swam within 1,000 feet of one of these acoustic receivers, the receiver heard it and record the time, the date, and the code for that particular shark, and just stored all of these data until periodically we had to scuba dive on them, bring the receivers up to the surface, and download all of those detection data. So we had 7 of these underwater acoustic receivers along the coast of mostly San Diego County, but also San Clemente Pier in southern Orange County. And over the course of our more than 3-year detection period, we amassed over 750,000 detections. So it's a lot of detections. And then I also just wanted to show you that just one of these sites in detail. We positioned the La Jolla receiver so that its 300-meter detection range encompassed pretty much the entire aggregation site, right? Almost the entire 95% KUD. So we could be pretty confident that if the leopard sharks were in fact aggregating in La Jolla, they would be detected by this La Jolla receiver. So what I'm going to show you now are some of the main take-home messages that we were able to distill out from all of those 750,000 raw detections. So the first thing is that these sharks exhibit strong daily fidelity to the La Jolla aggregation site. So we're looking at the study site and all of those 7 receivers. Yep, 7. Just want to make sure I had them all looking west now. And so what we found is that on average, these females we tagged in La Jolla, they were detected on average 288 of their days at liberty, which was more than 10 times as much as the next closest receiver called Dyke Rock, which was just on the other side of Scripps Pier. So the take home here is that they could have gone anywhere along the coast, and they certainly did, because you see they were detected at all of these places, but they spent the vast majority of their time being detected in La Jolla. But not only do they have strong daily fidelity to the La Jolla aggregation site, they also had strong annual fidelity. In other words, they were coming back year after year. So these are the 4 years of our study from 2009 to 2012. We tagged 12 of those 19 sharks, that is with the surgical implantation, in 2009. That's what those 12 dots are. And in 2010, we tagged the other 7 to make 19. After 1 year of tracking them, right, they were in La Jolla, then they left. And then after 1 year, 73.7% of them came back to La Jolla. You see that a few of them that we tagged left and didn't come back. We'll talk about why that might have happened in just a minute. After 2 years of tagging, we still had 52.6% of the original sharks. So more than half came back 2 years consecutively. And then 3 years after tagging, which we can only really look at the 2009 sharks for that, because our study ended in 2012, we still had 50% of the original sharks coming back in each of the following 3 years. Right? So the take home here is that most of these sharks that you see when you go snorkeling in La Jolla are the same ones coming back year after year. Now, what could have happened to the other ones that, left and then didn't come back? Well, we know that at least 2 of them were captured and killed by recreational fishers nearby. That happens. They are a target for recreational fishers. Luckily, not so much commercial fishers. But we've also had instances where our tagged animals, not necessarily leopard sharks, were captured but not reported back to us. So in addition to surgically implanting the sharks, we also externally tag them with a spaghetti tag that has a phone number and a website that people can report the shark captured. But sometimes the fishermen, they're busy, they forget, so they don't do it. So it wouldn't surprise me if more sharks, some of these other ones that didn't return, were captured but just not reported back to us. It's also possible that some of these sharks may have just left and found another aggregation site and decided to hang out there. Right? But for the most part, these sharks are coming back year after year. So the last part of the heavy science part of this talk, I want to just focus on these 6 females that came back in each of the 3 years. So I'm going to show you the original, well, not the original, the raw detection records for each of those 6 sharks. So we see here these kind of 6 ticker tapes, right? Each one of these spans 24 hours from left to right, and each line going down is a new day. So it spans over 1,100 days, which is our entire study period from 2009 down to 2012. And if we zoom in on one of these to kind of take a closer look at what you're actually seeing here, each one of those black pixels is a detection for that shark at the La Jolla receiver, the La Jolla aggregation site. So wherever you see black, the shark was in the La Jolla aggregation site. So what we see here, right away, you can see a daily, like a day-night difference here, right? So each one of these spans 24 hours from left to right, midnight to midnight. Noon is here in the morning, sunrise is around 6 a.m., sunset around 6 p.m., and you see that here. There's more black pixels, more detections between sunrise and sunset, and there's fewer detections at night. And that's consistent with these sharks going down into the canyon to feed on squid, which is an area that's outside of the detection range of the La Jolla receiver. But in addition to the day-night differences that you see if you go from left to right in each one of those ticker tapes, If you go from top to bottom, you can start to see the seasonal patterns, where you see all the sharks are present, then they're largely absent, then they're present again, absent again, and so on. And it's pretty amazing that there's a lot of synchrony, right? You see, for example, these 3 sharks on the right here, they all leave around the same time within days of each other. Then they're all gone. And then within like a day or 2 of each other, they all show up again. So there's a really interesting synchrony here in terms of the seasonal presence. And we can distill out, again, that raw seasonal data to make a graph like this. So you're looking at the months of the year from left to right. And on the y-axis is the average number of unique females detected at the receiver. And what you're seeing here are not 12 vertical bars, you're seeing 24 bars. And that's because each month was divided into 2 sections, 2 basically 15-day sections. And that just kind of gives us a little bit higher resolution when we're trying to understand what the seasonal patterns are. So the take home here is that there's clearly a high season from late June to early December. That's where we see the most sharks present. And it really peaks during August and September. Those are the months where we see the most sharks. And this comes after the known pupping season that I mentioned before is in April and May. So they give birth in April and May. Some of them may give birth in La Jolla. We do sometimes see some small leopard sharks while we're snorkeling, but most of them are obviously not present there. They're giving birth somewhere else. And then, of course, they have to mate, get the process started again. So when they show up in La Jolla in June, they're in the early stages of pregnancy. And the last thing I'll show you here is that this presence is highly correlated with sea surface temperature in La Jolla. This variable alone explains 86% of the variation in female abundance at this site. So basically, sea surface temperature is a great predictor for when sharks are hanging out. And it tends to be the warmer the water where we see the most sharks. And that's consistent with our hypothesis that these sharks are coming here to incubate their developing embryos. In terms of the conservation implications here, we know that these sharks come back year after year, and they spend a lot of time at this one particular spot. And so we can ask the question, what if they were not protected? I already mentioned that they exist inside of this small marine protected area, right? That marine protected area was not established to protect leopard sharks. It was established in 1970 to protect abalone and the walls of the submarine canyon. The leopard sharks just caught a lucky break here. So you can imagine how vulnerable these sharks would be. The fact that they're all pregnant, no less, if a bunch of fishers could come in here and, put gill nets out, I mean, they could wipe out the whole population in a week. Right? And there are other places, for example, in parts of Baja California, where gill nets near shore are still allowed. And there is evidence that this has really done a number on the leopard shark aggregation in Baja California. Right? So that's the importance of these kinds of studies, understanding what these animals are doing, where they're going, because it can help managers design very strategic and very focused marine protected areas that minimize disruptions to other stakeholders in the area. The last thing I'm going to talk about for just a few minutes is another project that I just started working on. So I mentioned before, we got aerial footage with not hot air balloons, helium balloons, right? Now we've got drones, and that makes it so much easier to find where the sharks are and send up a drone for 20 minutes and get some great footage. So what I'm trying to do now is trying to understand. So now we know why these sharks are here. Now I'm interested in how exactly does the aggregation work? Are the sharks attracted to each other? Is there a social component to the behavior here? Or are they just mutually attracted to a warm water patch or just something about this particular spot, but don't really care about the others that are around them, right? So I'm going to show you what we're starting to do now. So I'm going to show you a clip of drone footage here. I'm speeding it up at 4x, right? Which I think is helpful because you can start to see there's interesting patterns when you look at these sharks. I've also boosted the contrast and just kind of spruced up the video here, made it black and white. Okay, but we've got this amazing aggregation. And to try to understand whether there's like a social component here and whether there's like interactions among the sharks, we have to be able to track these sharks simultaneously. Now you're looking at over 150 sharks here. You obviously can't do that with acoustic tracking. You can't get the fine scale resolution that you need, but you can do it with machine learning and computer vision. So that's what I'm starting to work on now. So this is the same video clip, but with the sharks based on a method called thresholding, looking at kind of the contrast of the sharks. This is what the computer can see and what it can track now, all of those sharks. Okay. The next step in the computer tracking process is to basically assign a little outline around each shark. Okay, so we still see those sort of blobs, right? You see the little kind of grayish sharks moving there. Okay? But now we can start to track them. And what I think is the most interesting thing is we can zoom in on individual sharks and let them give us a kind of tour through the aggregation. So we're following here shark 135. And you can see that we can, get the paths for each one of these sharks, maintain their identities, even when they cross each other. If we get the algorithm just right, we can sort of match the identities when they come out on the other side. And that's what's essential here to kind of really understand whether there's any sort of interactions going on. And then you can see we can start to get the paths of all of these sharks. And right now I'm limiting the path to only about 30 seconds long, and then it kind of fades away. But if I don't do that and I just allow you to see what the paths look like, they're just going to keep on getting longer and longer. This is a 3-minute video clip that's, again, sped up at 4x. But you're seeing what I think actually about 160 sharks, what they're doing over the course of 3 minutes. And there's a lot of action here. There's a lot to unpack here. I haven't started the analyses, really looking at the fine scale, like movement. Like we want to try to model this behavior, look at like the interaction. So it's coming. But just being able to track the sharks, that was the first big step. All right. So the last thing I just want to acknowledge all the help that I've had, mostly from many undergrads over the years. It's a lot of fun work, but it's also a lot of kind of painstaking and hard work. That's a lot of time out in the sea, out in the sun. But when you get a lot of people working together, we can get a lot done. So with that, I want to thank you for inviting me again. Thank you for listening, and I would be happy to stick around and field any questions you might have.
Okay, we did have a couple questions pop up in like the chat. What's special about incubating embryos early in pregnancy since they are pregnant for 10 to 11 months and don't spend all year in La Jolla?
That's a great question. From what I understand, the rate of embryonic development is fastest in those first few months. So the embryos are growing really fast, like relative to the rest of gestation. So I tend to think that they kind of get the most bang for your buck, so to speak, by incubating during those first 5 to 6 months than they would if they were doing it later. It might also just be a matter of circumstance. Like they give birth in April and May, and the warmest water comes in the next few months. So it just may be like that's their only choice, right? That, once they're in, the later parts of pregnancy, it's much colder. So they don't really have that, that choice.
And then follow up to that was, are there other animals that use warmer water temperatures to speed up gestation?
So this has been seen, so over the last like 2 decades, it's become more and more common it's been more frequently discovered that female sharks and rays, when they're pregnant, will hang out in warm water. In fact, Bolsa Chica is thought to be kind of it's been called like a maternity ward for certain stingrays and guitarfish. So you get the pregnant females hanging out in there because it's a calm, warm area compared to just outside the mouth of that area.
I think
So
that's
it's pretty common.
terminology we'll have to start using for our tours is maternity ward.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, it also makes a lot of sense when you think about like birds, how they incubate their eggs to maintain that optimal temperature for development. It's not quite analogous, but I think it's pretty close.
Okay, next one was with your new projects, what you're working on currently, your current research. What do you mean by interaction and how do you measure and observe that? What exactly are you looking for?
Right. So what I would be interested in, for example, do the sharks show any evidence of being like attracted to each other? Like they're obviously attracted to the main aggregation site. That's why they're all there. And when you follow an individual and they get to the edge of the aggregation, they typically don't go too far before they turn around and come back. So they're clearly attracted to the group in general. But what if that's just a warm water patch? And the edge of the aggregation is like a thermal front where it's cold outside of that, and that's why they're turning around. So it's more to avoid the cold water than they're actually attracted to each other, right? So that's one part. But then within the aggregation, you can start to measure, like, do they turn toward each other ever? Or are they constantly sort of like avoiding collisions and, sort of repelled from each other? Or do they maintain a certain buffer zone around each other? You could also, because you can then maintain individual identities, you can also look at whether they have quote unquote friends. Like, are there certain individuals that hang out with each other throughout the video clip, or are they all just randomly milling around showing no association with anybody else? So those are the kinds of things that we can start to look at to see if there's like a social component to the behavior. What I'm hoping to do eventually is raise money to get a larger drone that not only has your typical like visual camera, but also a thermal camera. Because if you have that, now you can like simultaneously get visual video, like we've already seen, but also thermal video, at least of the very surface of the water. And that might show whether the sharks are in like a warm water patch. So that's also coming down the line.
I'm excited to hear about that. Next question was, what is the effect of demonization of sharks on TV? I know you did some work on this prior to the leopard sharks, yeah?
Yeah, so I noticed that too, right? Like if you always watch like a marine documentary, like dolphins always get this nice, like happy, majestic music, and then the sharks always get this like scary Jaws-like music. It turns out that just that makes a difference. So I did a study with a marketing psychologist where we did surveys and we had like over 2,000 people watch video clips of sharks and dolphins swimming with different background musics. And what we found was that viewers who saw sharks with, your typical scary shark music, when they were asked questions about kind of the importance of conserving sharks and like their overall opinion of sharks, how positive they viewed them, how much they liked them, whether they were beautiful, all kinds of things like that, they had an overall negative outlook. But when you showed sharks swimming with more like dolphin type music, they thought that sharks were beautiful and graceful and, we should be conserving them more. So background music matters. And I've been beating this drum for years now with Discovery Channel and Nat Geo, and it doesn't matter because it's all about the money and getting viewers. And so they don't care about the background music. But the other part of demonization is focusing so much on shark attacks. I've actually tried to get away from even using the word attack because I think it's kind of a loaded word. So I just say a shark bite on a person. I think that's a little bit more objective. Attack kind of implies like intent, which I think is not really appropriate when we're talking about these animals. Yeah, and then the news, they're always just sensationalizing things. So it definitely makes it harder to conserve these animals. For example, we have the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which is a federal law that basically protects marine mammals with very few exceptions. you can imagine if we had something like that for sharks. It's because we don't love sharks as much as we love marine mammals, right? Otherwise, we would put pressure on our politicians to enact laws to protect them. So the demonization and sort of the social perception of sharks is really important, and there are some other people who are really digging into that.
I have my own follow-up to that because
Sure.
a student asked me this on Thursday doing a tour I was leading. How do you feel about the term shark-infested waters?
Oh, I love it. No, I hate it. It's awful. What I always say is, you can't infest your own home, right? I mean, they live there. If anything, it's human infested, right? Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I hate that. I think it's dumb. I always try to point that out, and if I'm ever being interviewed, I try to make that point. Like, there's no such thing as shark-infested waters. And I also say, we should be excited and happy that we have sharks in our, in our water, because it's an indication that the environment is, at least fairly healthy, right? Because their food is there. Usually, when marine environments, or even any kind of environment, could be terrestrial too, when they start to go downhill, a lot of times the top predators are the ones that tend to go first. Either they leave or they die. So they're kind of a canary in the coal mine. So the fact that we're seeing them, including juvenile white sharks, which we're seeing more and more, that's a sign that their population is increasing and that their food is around. So it's all good. It's good news. And we have to just learn to live with them. One last thing I'll just say, just going back to like social perception, even though it's still not great, I feel like the last 10 years, have really improved a lot. I mean, I'm just thinking of like, just even like silly things like the Super Bowl with Katy Perry a couple of years, well, this is probably 5-6 years ago now. Like, there were sharks like dancing on the stage for the Super Bowl halftime show during her show. I mean, like, you never had that. You got Baby Shark now. I mean, you go to Target and like all the kids' clothes, it's like sharks everything. Like, I never had that when I was a kid. So it's moving in the right direction, but there's definitely still a lot of demonization.
Yeah, we have juvenile swell sharks in our interpretive center, and they are
Oh,
a
cool.
hit. Everybody
Yes.
loves them.
Yes. They're
Okay.
very cute.
Yeah. Next question was, has anyone else studied the other aggregations up the coast?
Yeah, I would say not as much as we have. I would say the next most studied group are probably leopard sharks around Catalina Island. There's I would say the Low Lab, which is based out of Cal State Long Beach. They've been doing a lot of work there. So I would say that's probably the most studied one after La Jolla, but some of the other ones, not really. I mean, the one up in Humboldt Bay, like they've done like seining and like sampling. So we know that they're all females, they're all pregnant, but no one's really like tracked their movements or looked at their like seasonal presence. So yeah, I would say just Southern California, that's kind of where it's at in terms of really studying the aggregation behavior.
You may or may not know this one. Have we observed the same phenomenon of accelerated gestation in terrestrial animals?
That's a good question. I should know this. It wouldn't surprise me, especially for certain reptiles. I mean, like, reptiles don't like sit on their eggs, right, to keep them warm, but a lot of like sex determination is based on temperature. I'm thinking of like sea turtles, for instance. I don't know if the temperature also affects the rate of development, but it's obviously important in their development, right, because it can determine whether they're male or female. So I don't know for sure, but I would guess so. Yeah.
I would also assume it's probably the ectotherms that need that external heat.
Yeah.
Some mammals could do it, who knows?
Yeah.
Oh, what is the next question? What's the best way for the general public to go see the sharks?
Great question. I'm going to go off screen for just a minute as I'm talking about this because I'm starting to run out of battery and I don't want to get dropped. Give me just a second here. Okay, so there's show, and I just went black. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, can you see me too? Because I can't see you.
I can see you. It seems like everybody else
Okay,
can as well.
that's fine. I'll just keep going
Me
then.
here.
Somehow when I plugged in my my power, everything went black. Okay, so the best, so you can see them year round, right? But it's sporadic, right? So you'd have to get lucky. So the best months to see them, I would say August and September. However, that said, it's July now, and we have seen them. They're around, but they're not super abundant. The drone surveys we've been doing the last week or so, I would say they've been averaging between about a dozen and 50, and they're kind of it's sporadic, right? So August and September, you tend to have the larger aggregations, pushing 150, 200 individuals, and they're there, like, I would say most days without exception. So some other things you might look at, I think low tide is the best time to go. The reason for that is there's an area kind of in this rocky reef that's just south of where the leopard sharks hang out, that at high tide, it creates a kind of like shallow ledge that's super calm, and that gets super warm. And so at high tide, a lot of the sharks are way back in that corner. And not necessarily like in front of the marine room, which is where we've been, which is like the restaurant that we always use as kind of our reference point. So I think low tide is best. Any time of day you can see them, but for some reason I feel like late afternoon seems to be pretty good. What else? If you want to sprinkle in like a Santa Ana condition, that's kind of nice because you get the offshore winds that kind of flatten out the waves. And so just kind of calm and nice to go out there. The downside is, so I said that it's like, it's all about water temperature, but there's like a limit. So what we've been seeing the last few years, which have been very warm, and they seem to be getting warmer, which is not good. Remember that spot in La Jolla is special because it's a degree or two warmer than the surrounding area. So that's why these sharks are there. But when it's uniformly warm everywhere, that spot is all of a sudden becomes not so special because they can get that temperature that they need anywhere. And so what we find is that once you hit about 71, 72 degrees Fahrenheit, which is what we're at right now, you tend to not see as many leopard sharks at the aggregation spot. And I think that's because they're just spread out, and or in slightly deeper water if the water gets too warm. So that's what you're kind of balancing there to find the most sharks. So I would say like I would say like between 65 and 70 degrees is ideal with all those other things, low afternoon, low tide, all of those things. That's where we see the most sharks. But again, you can see them anytime. It's just the most sharks is what I've just described.
And even if you don't get to see the sharks, there's other cool marine life there. I've seen a lot of Garibaldis and the like.
Oh
throughout the
yeah, and
years.
there's a lot of guitarfish and bat rays. We have banded guitarfish now, which are a seasonal presence when the water gets warm. So those are from Baja. There's triggerfish around now. Yeah, the water. Yeah, it's getting weird. The last 5 years, the water has been very warm. So now, like, by August, September, we get water temperatures in La Jolla that kind of routinely push 80 degrees off Scripps Pier. That's not normal. It's not good. So it's kind of high. It's hard to predict what the long-term implications are, but it's not good, unfortunately.
Okay. Does anybody have any other questions? Okay. Okay. When you set out to monitor a tracker over 48 hours, how big are the boats you use generally when you take 3-hour shift, and what is that like?
Good question. So the boats we use are small little skiffs. They're about they're 17-foot Boston whalers. So they're small boats, and when you have all of the tracking gear and all of your your sleeping bags and all and your food for 2 days, it's pretty cramped on there. So yeah, what is it like? Like there's moments I like, for example, being on the water at night is like really special because there's usually no wind. And so the water, it's just like this satin blanket. That's the kind of the best way I can describe it. It's just so pretty and so calm. And it's quiet out there. All you hear is the waves. You hear the sea lions barking, by the cove. So it's really peaceful and nice. Um, but at night you also get dew, and so just everything gets soaking wet, even if it's not raining, and so that's not fun. Then it just gets really cold, even though it's the middle of summer. Um, yeah, it's tough because there's no shade, right? So kind of just baking in the sun. So you have to really wear long sleeve everything and lots of sunscreen and but it's cool. It's cool, like just listening for that sound, the pinger, and kind of like just knowing it's just kind of like you and the shark. And like the shark has no idea what's happening. That we're just kind of following them. So that just thinking of that kind of makes me laugh. Yeah, so it's cool, but it's really hard work, and it's not something I like would go out of my way to start another project that would require that kind of work. But that's also the only way you can get that fine scale movement data. So
Okay, next one was does the sharks being somewhat skittish mean that snorkeling isn't very productive?
um, they're skittish if you're like loud and splashing toward them, which is what I discovered early on because I was like trying to like chase them, which they don't like because they've got predators, right? So they're quite cautious. Um, so if you snorkel with them, what I typically recommend is like once you see like one or two, just float. Don't kick, don't make a lot of movement because if you see one or two, there's probably more around you. And if you're just calm and still, not making noise, they're very likely to start swimming just right under you. So that's what I usually do when I go snorkeling now. I kick to swim to find them, and then once I find them, I just float. And sure enough, I'm usually surrounded by them once I find them.
I can imagine that a human kind of scrambling towards them might sound like a sea lion to them, and they
Yeah.
out of there. You just inadvertently gave one through that, but do you have any other tips for snorkeling with them?
Um, I guess like just some safety tips. I would say never go snorkeling alone. Not because you're worried about like sharks or anything, but just people have medical emergencies and all. So it's just never a good idea, I think, to go snorkeling alone. Um, I'm a wimp when it comes to water temperatures, so I would recommend a wetsuit if you want to be out there more than just like 10, 15 minutes. Like I get very cold very quickly, so I would recommend a wetsuit. The wetsuit also gives you flotation, so it kind of just makes it easier to float around and snorkel. If you don't have wetsuits, you can rent gear from a lot of the shops right there in La Jolla Shores. If you're not confident to go by yourself, you can go on a tour. There's tours that are offered, but I don't think you need like any special. Like you don't really need a guide. Because it's not like they fly. Like ideally, what they should be doing is fly a drone, know where the sharks are, and then that's where they lead the tour. But they don't. So sometimes the tours don't even see them. So it's I don't think there's a huge benefit to going with a tour, unless you just want to be with other people. Because drones are so popular now, I feel like most mornings now in the summer, there's like somebody flying a drone. You can just like, you can hear them, you can see them, see the controller. So you can even ask them like, hey, did you see any leopard sharks? Or just look and see if you see any drones. Because if they're just hovering over someplace, that's probably they're looking at leopard sharks. So you can go in over there. Yeah, so those are some of the other tips I would give.
So I think that kind of inadvertently answered another question of I assume this means recreational drones allowed in La Jolla if they want to get some photos.
Yep. Recreational drones are allowed. Yeah, like for me, because I do it for research, I have to have a remote pilot license. I have to actually operate under a commercial license. But for recreational, if you're just taking pictures for your own pleasure, yeah, you don't need any special permission. But it's just the standard recreational drone rules apply. You can't go higher than 400 feet. You're not really supposed to fly over people, although sometimes that's kind of hard to avoid. Um, yeah, and you just want to watch out because sometimes there's other like planes and other drones nearby, so you really want to be aware of where you're flying. Watch out for birds. I was doing a drone survey yesterday, and all of a sudden, a big flock of pelicans just like flew by, and I was like holding my breath, hoping that because it looked like they were going to collide, but I guess the altitude difference was enough that they were not at risk of colliding. But yeah, so you just want to be aware of that too.
Okay, another question of where do the females give birth and where are the males during all of this?
Ah, good question. So we don't know exactly where they're giving birth. I tend to think it's not like one special pupping ground. I think they're kind of just giving birth anywhere, because like surf fishers and pier fishers, they kind of catch juvenile leopard sharks, just kind of randomly. So I like all over. So I don't think there's a one special place. However, I have heard of like some of our local bays and coves along the coastline, like having more of them. So, for instance, like in San Diego County, we have Penasquitos Lagoon and Batiquitos Lagoon and Agua Hedionda. These are like, I guess they're kind of estuaries. So I've heard of juveniles being seen and caught more in there. So they could be giving birth in places like that that might offer a little bit more protection, some more food maybe. But we kind of see them just spread out all over the coastline. Oh, and then the other question was about where the males are. So we catch the males when we fish for leopard sharks in deeper water. So typically near a kelp forest. So when we fish, for example, at the edge of a kelp forest, like in let's say 30 to 50 feet, we catch both males and females there in about equal abundance. So yeah, so I think that the males probably just have a colder temperature preference, and that's why they don't really go to La Jolla. And there's obviously no mating opportunities in La Jolla in the summer because all the females are already pregnant and they're probably not receptive to mating. So there's probably no benefit to the males, sucking up the warm water and going there. So yeah, so I think that they probably just prefer colder water. So that's why we see that segregation between the males and the females.
Trudy made a point that for anyone wanting to fly a drone, La Jolla has nesting seabirds on the cliffs and harbor seals giving birth. I assume sea lions probably as well. So you probably shouldn't fly your drones over those.
Yes. Yes.
Just in addition to that. So are there any other questions before we keep on keeping on?